when working on Afro-Palearctic migrants, I was always impressed that a lot of the things we know on bird migration come from the Northern Hemisphere, and that we know very little about migration within the tropics. So this project, to start with, normally we end up with the acknowledgements, and maybe I'll start with the acknowledgements, is a collaborative effort. So it's a postdoc that I started last year at the University of Cape Town, with Fieldwork also in Zambia here on the map, working with a team of dedicated people that are doing a great work also on other topics on African birds. And this project is funded by the Swiss National Foundation. It's a collaboration also with the Swiss Ornithological Institute in Switzerland. And we also collaborate with other institutions in Africa. There is APLORI, there is the University of KwaZulu-Natal, Arusha, Kenya, and the University of the Free State. So this is really a joint effort to study intra-African migration. So now a bit more into the topic. Intra-African migration. So maybe first we will see what is intra-African bird migration. We will ask if we underestimate this phenomenon, and we will see why do birds migrate in Africa. What are we learning about intra-African migration? What are the challenges and what are the opportunities? And after this, there will be a time for a discussion. I'm sure many of you are interested and familiar with this topic. So just a little introduction. This article about the migration of the Pennant-winged nightjars was published more than 110 years ago. And it starts with saying that in general discussions of the migration of birds, those of the tropics are apt to receive little or no notice. So this stayed true for quite a good part of the 20th century, but luckily we now know much more about intra-African migration, and there is a broad interest into this topic. So fortunately, things have changed since this article, but it has been already a topic since quite a while. If we look just at the literature and at the classification of movement strategies in Africa, this is just a summary that I did from the accounts in Birds of the World, showing that about 2/3 of the African breeding species are resident, and then the rest is divided between nomadic, partial migrants, and very few birds that are strictly migrants. This means that their range really do not overlap over the year. And if we compare these results with just the range maps from the same source, basically from BirdLife and Birds of the World, we can see that the nomadic and partial migrants are very often classified as resident, so that these movements are underestimated, as well as if we look at the threat database. So this is Avonet. So of course, nomadic birds are not considered as migrants, and then many partial migrants are classified as resident, as well as we also notice some discrepancies between those classifications. So there is a lot to learn there. And for 218 species, the movement accounts in Birds of the World specify that the movement strategy is little known or poorly known. And if we look more into the details of the biogeography of birds' movements in Africa, these are the birds on this map that have seasonal range only. Means this is part of the range of the birds where they are only there in a specific season. We can see that these migrants are concentrated mostly in the savanna region of the Sahel and of tropical Southern Africa. And if we look at the partial migrants, so these are birds that only parts of the population and parts of the individual migrate. They are much more widespread, so it's more than 100 species at one location, sometimes that are partial migrants. And this is where the biggest knowledge gaps are still located. Then if we compare this with partial Palearctic migrants, the Palearctic migrants are all around sub-Saharan Africa, but the highest species richness of Palearctic migrants is in the north of the equator, mostly because it's located closer to the breeding grounds. And then the nomads are also much likely to occur also in arid regions of Southern Africa, for example. And just a comparison with the general species richness of birds in Africa that explain also why you have more nomad birds around the Great Lake, is also because this is where the species richness hotspots are located in sub-Saharan Africa. Now, why do birds migrate? So if I ask you this question generally worldwide, most of the people would answer because it's cold in winter. So if you are a bird that is eating insects and you see this kind of landscapes, when winter comes, you just want to escape. And that's true for large parts of the world. And it's a bit more complex like than this when we go into the tropics. So why do birds migrate within Africa? There is several reasons, but one of the main reasons of intra-African bird migration is visible here on this picture is, for example, this landscape has received no rain for more than 6 or 7 months, and suddenly come the first rains at the end of October in Austral Africa. The summer arrives and the rains come with, and these landscapes that is completely dead and dry is starting to teem with life. And birds have to adjust to these changing conditions. And this map is showing this. So the vegetation greening moves rhythmically back and forth between north and south of the continent. So when austral summer comes, the rains and the greenness move south, and when the northern summer comes, which is basically still the case now, you would have rains and vegetation greening in the Sahel region. So what do we know about intra-African migration? So we know now that many of these birds move with the rain, but it's much more complex than this. And first, a little overview of different types of movements and what has been studied so far. So this example is the Abdim stork. It's a paper that was published 20 years ago in Ostrich, and they tracked Abdim storks between Niger here in the Sahel and Southern Africa. And this is the range map. So the breeding location here is in orange, and the non-breeding location, the non-breeding regions are in blue, and the migration of the birds between the two regions. And this is just a little plot that shows the distribution of the range, a non-breeding range and breeding range across the latitude. So the Abdim stork is a bird that breeds only in the northern hemisphere and that moves south of the equator and to Eastern Africa during the non-breeding season. And there are 25 species that do such long distance typical migration with no range overlaps in Africa. That's not a lot. And then there is partial intra-African migration. That's a much more widespread phenomenon. The African cuckoo is one of these species. And interestingly, it has parts of the range south of the equator here in Southern Africa and north of the equator. And this is a bird that was tracked here in Nigeria and that migrated closer to the equator when came the dry season. And what we can see is that most of the range is considered as year-round resident. However, these birds move within this range. And this is also why we have difficulties to understand and to know how many of these birds move, because there is parts of the range where we expect them to occur year-round, and this needs further investigation. And in total, so that's also a big question that we have. What the birds of the southern populations are doing? Do they move closer to the equator? Like this shows, do they move even to the other side of the equator? So for African cuckoos, for example, this is still to be discovered. And there are 124 species that have partial range overlap, like this one. And then you have partial migrants with more specific and particular migration strategies, like the Kerman bee-eaters. They haven't been tracked, but we know from the literature that they apparently do a loop migration where they move south in the summer. Then when come the dry season, they move north closer to the equator and come back to breed in the middle. And you can see on this plot how the range is distributed. And that's more unusual and different to what we have, for example, in Europe. Then some specific cases are like reverse migration. So the dusky lark is one of these birds that breeds closer to the equator. They breed in the dry season, and when comes the rain, they move further south. So they do kind of an opposite strategy than what we saw before with the African cuckoo. And here an example of partial migrants that has a seasonal range that is undescribed. So if we look at the range map of these birds, it seems to be resident all year, even though we know from the literature that there are movements. And recent tracking data, you'll see more in detail later in this talk about this data. Recent tracking data suggests that they move more than 1,000 kilometers within this range. And these are 176 species, so it's more than the partial migrants we have seen before. And after this, we have species of from which the status is unclear. That's the great white egret, for example. So it's likely that parts of the population do some migratory movements, other parts of the population do nomadic movements, but they can move several thousand kilometers across the region, connecting the water bodies, for example, between the Okavango, eastern Zambia, and the Congo. And that's data that is freshly collected by Jonah Gula and the University of KwaZulu-Natal. They are doing really an amazing work on unraveling these nomadic movements and these waterbird movements that are really important also for conservation. And this brings us to the nomadism. And these are birds that move around. They don't move around seasonally and rhythmically, where they go back and forth to a breeding site, but they move across large distances as well. So this marabou stork moved, for example, between South Africa and Kenya. So this example shows us that conservation needs to be continent-wide, that these birds move well beyond the borders of protected areas, and that even beyond the borders of countries. So thanks again, Jonah, for sharing this amazing data with us. And we have then a last category of movements that I thought it's important to add is the altitudinal movements. That's a screenshot from Jensen et al. In Ostrich. It's a paper that just came out last year, where they tracked these birds, these alis, in the mountains of Tanzania, and showing that they move twice a year between high elevation and low elevation, and that these birds do kind of movements that are much more complicated than just once a year moving back and forth. So it's almost 200 species that do altitudinal movements in Africa, and that's also a big knowledge gap. Now we can go in the methods to study bird movement. So how do we learn about all of this? We can simply watch the birds. For example, a raptor migration. If you sit on a place where raptors migrate, there are radars that can detect birds flying overhead. There is ringing, where when you're lucky enough for someone to find your ring, you can know that the bird moved. Isotopes, where we can see where the birds grew their feather. And here we will focus mostly on biologging. So biologging is GPS tags, satellite tags, and also in our case, archival multi-sensor geolocators. And now we will see a bit more in detail some recent and ongoing tracking studies that focused on intra-African migratory birds. And this used geopressure, which is a recently developed package from Raphael Nussbaumer that is aimed at studying the migration of birds using geolocators that record atmospheric pressure, light, and other parameters. Just to precise, these are tags that must be recaptured, so it's not like GPS tags where you can get the data in real time. And now we will go to South Africa and see one of the first very small birds that was tagged with these loggers in South Africa, which is a project that was initiated by Dayo on the picture here. So Dayo Ozinubi was a postdoc at the FITS a few years ago and started this collaboration between the FITS and the Swiss Ornithological Institute. So what did these woodland kingfishers do? So the 5 birds that provided data moved all the way 4,000 kilometers north to South Sudan. So they bred in South Africa and moved to the other side of the equator here and crossed the Congo rainforest to reach other areas of savannas. And looking a bit more in details where they exactly went, all 5 birds went to the same location. This is in different years and different birds, and they all went to the same area, plus minus 100 kilometers. So this is not where the bird moved, but it's the most likely location based on the pressure data that we had on the birds. And that was quite a surprise to see that these birds all went to the same area. And why would they move? So you can see on the right, that's the typical habitat of the woodland kingfisher. It's open woodlands, mostly riverine habitats with big trees where they breed and that they use to perch and sing. And on the left, it's the migration of the birds between the austral summer and now the austral winter, the austral winter, when the rains move north and they follow these rains and these habitats. Like by doing so, they can benefit from food abundance year round. Some of you will have to look in detail at the right picture, and maybe you will see that there is not only woodland kingfishers in this habitat. I'll now go to the next slide, and we also can see how these birds migrate, not only where they migrate, why they migrate, but how they migrate. So this plot shows the distance from the breeding site here, 4,000 kilometers between South Africa and South Sudan, and the altitude at which the birds travel. And in blue, it's the stationary sites where the bird stopped. And we have here the migratory flight where the bird flew at almost 3,000 meters at some point. And the ground elevation here that is estimated from a digital elevation model is important because in Southern Africa, you can see that most of the Southern African continent is located at more than 1,000 meters. So if we want to know how high the birds fly, it's important to take this into account. And then we can see during the night how these birds migrate. So none of the woodland kingfishers we tracked was migrating a single minute during the day. They only leave, here you have the time of the year and the time of the night. And this is sunset here, the black line, and sunrise, this other black line on top. And these are the migratory flights. So that's when they leave the breeding site. Then they have a long stopover in Zambia. Then in green, you have the first flight above the Congo. And then for almost 6 months, the birds stayed stationary in South Sudan and came back within a shorter time back to South Africa, where they come at the end of November when the rains are well advanced. So now we saw a long distance migrant, and we look into short distance migration. This is more difficult to detect. It's birds here that have, so it's red-capped robin-chats and mangrove kingfishers. They are mostly present year-round, or at least expected to do so in most of their range. And movements are known from the literature, so it's not something completely unexpected. But for the first time, a team from Arusha, Kenya, and the Vogelwarte, so it's Colin Jackson and Raphael Nussbaumer and Kira Lennox that initiated this project, started to tag these birds in 2020. And it was still a surprise, at least for me, it was a surprise to see that the 15 individuals from these two species that are here in the maps all went to the same area of northern Mozambique and southern Tanzania to breed. So they were tagged in the non-breeding season in Kenya, and they moved almost 1,000 kilometers further south to breed in another region. And the regularity of this movement is still impressive. And why did they move there? You can see on this plot, there is the latitude. On top is the breeding site in Kenya, and the bottom is on top is Kenya, the non-breeding site, and on the bottom is where they breed. And in the middle bottom, you can see the rains. So in December start the rain. It's the austral rainy season, the big rainy season where these birds come to breed. And this also brings vegetation greening. In the back is the NDVI, is the satellite-derived vegetation index. And on top, you can see when these birds come back to Kenya, and they also enjoy the big rainy season there in Kenya and the vegetation greening. And they have, in Kenya, it's closer to the equator, so you get kind of two rainy seasons, a big one here in between April and July, and the smaller one that is like here in December and January. So by doing these movements, these birds benefit obviously from higher food abundance due to the rain and subsequent vegetation greening. These movements have also implications for conservation. So these birds were tagged in Kenya, where they are relatively well protected. However, they moved to a region between Mozambique and Tanzania, which has seen a lot of deforestation. And you can see in purple on this map the areas that have lost forests since the 2000s. And these are areas where habitat degradation is intense. And it just shows that we need to protect these birds along their migratory routes. And other species along this flyway are even more threatened than these two. Now we look a bit more into detail about flight migration and duration. And this was a bit unexpected that the pre-breeding, so when this moved to Kenya, are longer migratory movements than the post-breeding. So they spend more time in flight and also more days. So the bigger the dot, the bigger the cycle, the longer the period in days. So birds that migrated more hours also spent more days on the way, means they had to stop over and to refuel on the way. And the post-breeding movements, when they come back north to Kenya, are much shorter. And the lines link the same individual in pre-breeding and post-breeding, which suggests that that's the same individual always did a faster route to go up than to go down. Now, why this? The main answer that we found is the wind support. So in the pre-breeding, when the birds move from Kenya to Mozambique, there is little or wind support or even headwinds, so they can move relatively slow. And in the post-breeding, when they move back from Mozambique, there is strong supporting winds, which allows them to fly much faster and which they select to fly. So we will have time at the end for a question, but now we go to another project, and that's more the projects I will show now are a bit more of a work in progress. It's here the migration of the Pennant-winged nightjar, and that's here you can see on the picture in the bottom is Chima, is one of the person that is instrumental in the fieldwork for this project. So we'll go with him in about 6 weeks from now back to Zambia to study these birds. And that's the Pennant-winged nightjar. It's an impressive bird with very long flight feathers. And besides this, it's also a bird that has been known to migrate for a long time. And that's the same paper that I mentioned from Chapin at the beginning of the talk from it's from 1915. It's more than 110 years ago. And this paper describes the distribution of the Pennant-winged nightjar. I don't know if you see my arrow if I move it here, but I guess it should be fine. Like on Southern Africa, you have the breeding sites, and then the birds move north of the equator here in the non-breeding sites, and that's one of the few species that have no overlap between breeding and non-breeding range. And on top of it, the green dots show the eBird data here in breeding and in non-breeding, including some surprising sightings in Sudan or even in the middle of the oceans where a bird was found completely lost. So these birds are known to breed at the end of the dry season. They come back to Southern Africa at the end of the dry season. And this is just before the rains. So this data shows nests that were collected between 1970 and 1998 in the field site in Zambia where we work. And we are lucky enough to have this historical data that were collected. So these are every black dot is a nest over the years, and all the nests were always found before the rain start here. And in the middle graph, you have the temperatures. So these birds breed during the warmest time. And on the top panel, you see the fire regimes. And these birds always breed after the fire come and before the rain. So it's a short time window between the fires and the rains. And one of the reasons is that these birds often lay their eggs on the ground, and they also use open ground for displaying and forage above openings in forests. So they often breed in burnt areas. They don't only breed in burnt areas, but they are often related with those. And on this graph, you can see the fires in yellow and the observations of these birds in Africa in blue. And we can see that they tend to come to Southern Africa just after the fires and then move back to the north. And the lack of data in the north of the equator is also something that we are now wondering whether these birds also track the fires in the non-breeding season. So from this data, we can see clearly that they come just after the fire and use post-fire succession habitats in Zambia when they come back to breed, but it's not clear what they do in the non-breeding season because most of the sightings comes from Uganda and Eastern Africa, and we have very little information from what happens in Central African Republic, Cameroon, Nigeria, and even South Sudan, where these birds move in the non-breeding season. So that's also what we want to answer with the logger data that we have, and hopefully in the future we can also put some GPS tags to see exactly what habitat they use year round. So we've deployed last year 16 loggers, and the next fieldwork will take place in October this year. And that's an example of a male Pennant-winged nightjar that is displaying over a burnt clearing in the Miombo woodlands of Zambia. And that's at the display site that we could capture these birds to tag them. Just before I continue, I wanted to mention that this project is also related to another bigger project that was started a few years ago by the Max Planck and UCT Center for Behavior and Coevolution and the Fitzpatrick Institute. And on this picture, you can see Joel Radue, which is working specifically on movement ecology and fire. And so he focuses mostly on the bronze-winged courser on the right. And the bronze-winged courser is a bird that is specifically uh, related to fires. And Joel will probably present you the results in another talk very soon on Fridays for Birds. So we will be happy to invite him. And therefore, I will not expand more on the details, but I found it's important to mention this project to give a complete overview of what is being done on the drivers of movement in Africa, because fire regimes are a driver of movement that is very typical to tropical region and in particular very developed in Africa. So in the hands of Joel, you can see a baby of the bronze-winged courser that is about to be tagged. Now the next species. Sorry, it's a lot of species. So we are really starting to learn a lot about these intra-African migrants. That's the African paradise flycatcher. It's a bird that is weighing about 14 grams and that is widespread over Africa. So 14 grams is not much. So it has been only a few years now that we can tag such small birds. And most of the range is also described as resident, but we have migration described from the literature. And what we wanted to achieve by starting to tag these birds is to see if the different populations have different migration strategies. There is the migration, the subspecies grantee in Southern Africa, in the very south of South Africa, that is expected to migrate west along the coast, and the subspecies from Southern Central Africa that is expected to migrate further north. But we know very little about these movements, and we were hoping to be able to tag birds from these four populations. And so far in the pilot study, we started with the number 1, which is in Zambia, and we tagged 10 birds last year. So hopefully this will provide interesting results that we can use to continue these projects in the future. And then this is a project that we hoped to achieve, and that so I also need to be honest and to show some projects that are a bit more difficult. So that's the African Pita project. African Pita have a population in Western Africa and in Southern Africa. The Southern African ones are known to do long distance migration, but we don't exactly know where they go in winter. There are sightings in the equatorial regions of Central and Eastern Africa. Now, we wanted to tag them in northern Mozambique, and we were not sure about what tags to use because they spend a lot of time in the shade. And then the field site where we were planning to do this was also attacked, so that everything has been postponed. And last year we explored some other areas where this species breeds in the Zambezi Valley. So this is between Zambia and Zimbabwe. And we went to these 3 sites to see what is possible to do or not. Found the Pita, but it was very difficult. And just to give you an idea, between these 2 sites is only 140 kilometers as the crow flies, or the Pita flies. But the reality was 230 kilometers of a very bad road, 3 hours to cross the border, and more than 9 hours to drive between these 2 sites. And for now, this project, as this picture could maybe illustrate, is I would not call it a dead end, but is on hold for now because we still need to figure out what tag we can use and how we can capture these pitas, whether or not we need to recapture them and everything. So if people are interested to go for it, we would be very happy to hear this and to discuss further. So that's a bit where we stand. And this brings me to the question of the challenges of studying intra-African migration. So there are challenges in this, and fundings are limited. There is insufficient interest in general from research organization. We are very happy to see that this is just growing, but This is still work in progress. Access to the most recent technology is very unequal also. So it's no secret if I tell you that funding and access to technologies is more limited in Africa than some other parts of the world. And permits and administration are also a big limitation. So it's not that you can just go out in the field and put loggers. You need to plan in advance. You need to obtain permits. In so many cases, it can take years. So that's some of the challenges. So what can we do? That's just an example of one of the field assistants of the project in Zambia, who is uh, who is talking and teaching the kids of the nearby school. And it was quite a surprise to see that all these kids are very interested not a surprise that they are very interested in nature, but a surprise that most of them know these birds, know that these birds are here only in time of the year. And I think in the future, we are already now seeing an increasing interest from students and from people in Africa on these topics. And I'm very confident that in 10 years from now, we will know much more about this, and that many people in Africa will study this topic. So there are also some programs that can facilitate this work. And the Swiss Ornithological Institute has a program now to share geolocators. So if you are if you're ringing birds and interested to tag them, you can get in touch with them. They have an online form. They have an email address also where you can ask questions. So that's I think a very good opportunity to start studying these birds using the most recent methods. So this brings me to more opportunities to study intra-African migrants. So why should we do this, and why is it what are the opportunities in this? So that's an example of a colleague that is Myren from the FITS as well, that is also doing a postdoc more on coevolution, and she's here deploying a tag on an African cuckoo. So that's how we are starting to answer some of the mystery of the questions on intra-African migrants. And so what are the opportunities? So Africa is a natural laboratory to study the ecology and evolution of migration. It's an emerging field of research. It's of major conservation relevance. So to protect these birds, we need to know first if they migrate, where they migrate, if their population decline. The tracking technologies are increasingly available. That's very important. It's now the time to do this because the technology is available. And there are also other methods than tracking. So today I was focusing a lot on tracking, and actually the African Bird Atlas and eBird data, for example, open new avenues. So as far as the years go, we know increasingly more. We have increasingly more data, and we can also study how the abundance of these birds fluctuates throughout the annual cycle, and that's just very it gives a lot of hope that in 10 years from now we will know much more about intra-African migration. So I could not finish this talk. I'm sorry, I'm almost done, but I could not finish this talk without mentioning one of the big mysteries in intra-African migration. This example is, for example, the blue swallow. And there is a problem with this bird is that they live in habitats, high elevation grassland, like on these pictures that are very threatened. And they are very localized. Population is very patchy. Parts of the areas that are colored on these maps don't have the birds anymore. And one of the problems that we have is that we don't know where they go, but there's so few left that we are not sure even, at least in South Africa, the population is now probably too small to even hope to deploy trackers. So the population in Zimbabwe would be possible. For example, on this picture, it's the habitat in Zimbabwe where that still holds the stronghold of the species in Southern Africa. So that's one of the big mysteries. And these birds could be tagged, and we could probably help preserve them at least by knowing where they go. Another mystery in intra-African migration is the mountain pipit. So that's the habitat of the mountain pipit is the highlands of Lesotho and the Drakensberg region of South Africa. And that's the range of the species. And that's the range that we read, that we can still find in the textbooks. But recent research has demonstrated that all the specimens that were collected in Central Africa, for example, were not mountain pipits. So now we really don't know where these birds go, and it might be that they are just altitudinal migrants. So we have now started a project with the University of the Free State and the University of KwaZulu-Natal, and hopefully in a few years from now, we will know where these mountain pipits are going during the winter. Another project that is also, I think, not all tracking projects are of high conservation relevance, but this one is because it's a species that is very endangered and that breed in isolated forest patches. The population here in Eastern Africa is almost extinct already. You saw that it's the same flyway that we saw before with the kingfishers and rubbing chats. And in South Africa, there is the University of KwaZulu-Natal that started tagging these birds last year. And you'll hear more about this soon from John Agula and his colleagues. And just a dream, but the African river martin is a species that migrates in equatorial regions. So we saw a lot of species that migrate in tropical seasonal regions. This species is a migrant that moves close to the equator, and very little is known about them. On top of this, it's just a fantastic bird. So if one day we could get to know a bit more about these movements, it would be for sure fascinating. And before I conclude, there will be a symposium on this topic next year at the PAOC in Marrakesh. So it's the Pan-African Ornithological Congress. I hope many of you can attend. And also, if you are working in intra-African migrants and you have not been invited yet, please submit an abstract, and we will be happy to have more speakers in this symposium, in which several people that I show from whom I show the work in this presentation will participate. So I would like to thank everyone involved in this effort, and thank you for listening.